Welcome to this episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World. I'm Professor Jeff Guernsey with Dr. Jeff Heyman. Institutions, that sounds like a really boring thing to talk about, but economists appreciate that term.
It is.
Why?
Well, institutions are really important. And first of all, you're going to say, well, what is that? What is an institution? You know, you have an institution of higher learning. You have Cedarville University, and that's one institution. But that's not really what we're talking about. When economists talk about, usually they'll use the words institutional arrangements. It's kind of the setting wherein individuals can make their choices. What kind of rules of the game, if you will? That's perhaps a really good way to think about institutions. And they're important because they will help an entrepreneur or any actor engage with the uncertainty of the future, because as we talked about in a previous video, whether it's risky or uncertain, the future is unknowable. It's not unimaginable, but it is unknowable. And so we have to step out into that future, and we can have a better way to prepare for that unknown future if we have some things that we can count on in the future. So, for instance, one very important institution that we would talk about in economics is kind of the rule of law. So, rule of law might include, in most economies that are going to be successful, you're going to have private property rights. As we've talked about in this video series before, better known as private stewardship responsibilities from our perspective, but nevertheless, the fact that you can own private property and that you can work hard and that you would be able to preserve that private property because you don't need to worry about somebody coming by and stealing it from you. They can't take it from you. That gives you a better incentive to work hard and to prepare for the future. Societies that tend to protect those rights tend to have better material outcomes. For instance, one of the things that I think you've read Hernando de Soto's Mystery of Capital. And he talks about the lack of property titles to what he calls capital. Well, that lack of titling makes it so people in Haiti, for instance, there's a reason why they always get to a certain level of a shanty and being worth, and I think they traded the last in the book something like $2,000 each. And these people in Haiti would be unwilling to invest more in a shanty because they didn't have good legal title. They couldn't be sure that if they did that investment, they would reap the benefit. So if they'd had better titling, this is the whole point of his book, if they had that institution in place, there'd be a lot more incentive to improve the condition within Haiti. And that's a result. So incentives really matter, and the institutions really matter to guide people's incentive to do better economic behavior. And rule of law and property rights are just some examples of institutions that are out there. There are more, but we would call those typically formal institutions. And so that's contrasted, of course, with, if they're formal institutions, they're probably
informal
institutions. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we count on in the future that guide our behavior. Formal institutions tend to be codified in law, constitutions, written contracts that would guide, that you can count on. Informal institutions are kind of these norms of behavior that everybody just takes for granted. And so we have certain expectations that if we do a certain action, somebody else is going to respond in a certain way. And it depends on the culture that plays in effect. But we find those are often more important than other things. You know, I write in the textbook, I gave a personal example, but it's go beyond that. Pretty much if you get into go to the store and you buy something and you walk out the door, I don't care what store it is, and you notice that it's all messed up when you get it, open up the package and see, what can you almost certainly do?
You're going to be able to return it.
You're going to go back to the store. There may not be no written contract that requires it, but we have kind of a norm. Look, if you sold me something rotten, you should get this. This is on you. It's not me. You know. And here's the thing. Formally, we couldn't do anything about it if they refused. But what could you do if they don't do that?
You'll go somewhere else.
You're not going to go back there.
Yeah.
And so they find it in their institutions. So these informal institutions tend to evolve. People tend to stand by their word. They tend to stand by their products for some sort of reasonable basis. Where the line is, we don't have exactly. If you came back in the store like 5 months later, they might not give you your money back. These are all negotiable because they are informal. But that helps guide our behavior too. We can be a lot more confident. Imagine a world where you couldn't do that, Dr. Guernsey. How confident would you be about buying their product? What would you want to do?
Well, you wouldn't. You would probably spend more time inspecting it and make sure it's
Exactly.
of good quality before you brought it home.
Institutions tend to reduce our transactions costs associated, and that makes us all better off. So that's one of the other reasons for the importance of institutions, whether formal or informal. I would just throw one other thing out there. Darren Acemoglu wrote a book along with, I think, Jim Robinson a few years ago, Why Nations Fail. We've gotten so wealthy in the world. Counter Adam Smith's question about an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Now societies have generally evolved, globalization and mostly free trade and open markets, such that it's the exception. Why aren't these countries growing? And their principal conclusion was, if a country practiced and had institutions that were inclusive, so many people could participate, so you could count on keeping the product of your labor, those cultures tended to do very well. And then that was contrasted what they called extractive cultures, and institutions that tended to not protect people's property and would not allow all people to be a part of the process and excluded parts of the population. They tended to have lower economic outcomes. So these are all ways that institutions matter. You should see them really as foundational, that's something that helps an entrepreneur above that really plan and work, because the future is still unknown, but it's not unimaginable, and it gets a lot easier to imagine it if you had solid institutions that you can count on. It's a way to reduce the uncertainty of the future.
Okay, that's just what I was getting ready to ask you. So both formal and informal institutions, written or unwritten, rules of conduct, et cetera, can reduce uncertainty.
Yep.
Okay.
And as we said earlier, they can reduce uncertainty, and they reduce significantly our transactions costs for making exchange and doing all the things that we think would be beneficial for economic success.
So therefore, just the presence of those institutions can promote economic growth, human flourishing, et cetera.
Exactly. And lack thereof prohibits that. That's exactly what we saw in societies like former command and control economies like the Soviet Union and so forth. That didn't have those institutions.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us today for this episode of No Free Lunch: Economics for a Fallen World. We'll see you next time.